Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to hopefully address some of the questions that seem to be reoccurringly raised concerning the Blender game engine, and most of these points will actually apply to any game engine within certain parameters. So this hopefully will be more of an open-ended look at where some of the concerns are coming from and the reactions from developers such as myself on the stance that we think is best to take. So most of the issues that have been raised in recent times have come from various discussions held by developers as well as by Ton himself concerning the roadmap for the Blender game engine and for Blender as a program itself. Now, most of these concerns are simply based in the truth that at the moment the Blender game engine codebase is not fun to develop, and it has serious flaws which make it a program which isn't particularly fun to work with, and for all that can be said for money, most programmers do not want to work on a code base that is ugly. You could pay, at least in my experience, you could pay a programmer half to work with a good, clean code base, than giving them double the money for something that drives them insane. Within certain parameters, of course. But ultimately, developing has to be a fun experience. It's like any job, except for a lot of programming is completing a challenge. And if you always feel like your solutions are half-baked, then that isn't going to be a fun task. And that does, especially for developers of the Blender game engine, most of whom are contributing their own spare time, and they're not paid for doing so, it has to be something that is fun. So the issues are real, but what is the stance that most people are taking on this? Well, I think it's really important that we identify what a game engine is. I've already raised this point a number of times, but that really defines where this question goes, because people have this fear that the Blender game engine will be removed, and there's going to be nothing in its stead. Now, whatever direction people take, there will be a game engine that is integrated with Blender. That's just the way it's going to work, because people are quite happy using it at the moment, the users are, and so what will probably happen is if the Blender game engine was dropped from Blender, then someone would fork it and use the code in their own fork of Blender. However, that doesn't have to be the only solution, and the other solutions are that we integrate another game engine inside Blender and use the existing functionality which is provided by the Blender scripting API in order to facilitate that. And the other option is looking at the options provided by the Blender roadmap. I personally do not believe that the game engine, and I think most people would agree, will remain in the current form during the interactive mode designs of the future. That doesn't mean to say that they won't take inspiration from the current game engine, but ultimately they are different goals, and one of the main purposes of rewriting the engine is that it's not in a good shape at the moment, and therefore if they are going to attempt to integrate something that's interactive, it won't just be the Blender game engine version 2, it'll be something different. Now, one of the concerns I have as a developer is that whatever this interactive mode is, it will be it'll be more of a subset of the existing Blender game engine, sorry, the Blender features, and it will not be designed with performance and real-time games in mind. And that's fine if that's what makes sense for the developers of it. But for most users, they don't want to have complex simulations at the detriment of frame rate. They don't want to have advanced skinning or potentially, probably more accurately, they want to have realistic lighting if it causes them to drop to 20 frames a second at best. And all of these features mean that, you know, running the interactive mode with cycles, for example, wouldn't make any sense. Now, the other issue I take with this is that game engines are designed for making games, and the interactive mode sounds like an extension of the animation framework. I already don't particularly like the way that animation is handled in Blender. I can't necessarily offer a better solution, but I find it discordant with the rest of it. If you look at the physics, for example, it just seems a little bit implemented on top of what Blender is at the moment. Now, I mean, that has changed significantly over the progress that's been made with that branch, but ultimately, a game engine whatever's left won't feel like a game engine. It'll feel like an interactive mode, and that is the difference. It does mean, for a start, that things like the ability to control what the game loop does will be gone, and you'll basically be left to Blender doing some scheduling, which won't be fun. But all of these issues are more developer issues and less user issues. So let's leave that for now and having looked at all the different pathways, let's actually define what a game engine is, because that's really where we go from here. Well, the Blender game engine really consists of three main components. There is the UI, which exists in Blender. That's the logic editor here, that's all of the properties, the game properties, the materials, all of this. And you'll notice that this is actually Blender's user interface, and the rest of Blender can access all of the same data. It's not just limited to the game engine. So this is a core part of the Blender code, and the only thing that would disappear probably if the game engine was removed would be the logic editor panel, at least for now. So that's the UI. There's also the internal engine code, which basically runs the game engine. It renders the graphics, it will run the physics code, it'll run the network code, which is technically the message interface, it'll run any logic bricks, it'll do all of that behind the scenes without your knowing. And finally, the scripting interface, which is written in Python, is what most users will think of as the coding API, and that's very specific to the Blender game engine. It's only importable in the game engine, and that basically allows you to extend what the internal code does. So those are the three main components, and if we start the game engine, we've transitioned now from the UI to the internal code, really, and we can also access the scripting interface. Good. So there's one thing we need to note here. I've already mentioned about the fact that the UI is consistent with the rest of Blender, and that is true of anything that was implemented in Blender. So if we got rid of the Blender game engine, the UI would change very little. So a lot of the power that's offered by the Blender game engine is simply this integration with the user interface. Now the important thing about the user interface is that it can be read in Python, and that means that any other scripting interface that can access Python can access the data that's provided by the user interface. And that means that if you wanted to integrate another game engine, it would have the same level of access really to all of the data that's currently implemented as the game engine does. So you could actually convert the physics, the mesh, etc. just by reading this UI properties and interact with it using the UI. So that takes basically the main advantage of the Blender game engine. If you got rid of the user interface, you didn't have this logic brick editor, that you didn't have any of these materials, you wouldn't be using Blender for a start, and secondly, you'd have to manually configure everything. You'd have to define materials, you'd have to define their specularity, you'd have to define the starting positions by vectors, you'd have to define things like what physics type you get, and that's fine, and a lot of developers would like that kind of control, but all of the ease of use which the Blender game engine currently has wouldn't be there. And for that reason, the Blender game engine wouldn't have any attraction to new users or to existing users. The only real reason, to my mind, that the Blender game engine is currently so powerful or considered so useful is because of this user interface integration. To create a in quote marks game, it simply is it's as simple as basically creating an object, which is the cube in the default scene, pressing P and watching the simulation run. So if you get rid of that, then you then start looking at what the rest of the game engine offers, and that really is quite limited. Let's actually look at some of the features that the game engine currently has. We have bullet physics integration, which is most engines now have, and that's a good thing. I say most. A number of engines have, and it's a very powerful library. We have recast and detour. We have logic bricks. We have the video texture support for rendering custom textures, etc. in the engine, and videos and so on. We also have the order space library, which is quite useful, and we also have a rendering engine. And that sounds quite good on superficially, but if we actually look deeper into the code base, then essentially what you have is a rendering engine which only supports forward rendering, and is, although it's well encapsulated, it's still difficult to work with. It requires some extension in order to work with different rendering modes. So it's not particularly fast with multiple lights, and it's looking more like a legacy rasterizer than modern engines are pushing forward. And things like shaders are very limited in what they can offer. We don't have geometry shaders or other rendering modes, such as different rendering libraries like DirectX, and therefore compute shaders. It doesn't offer tessellation shaders, so there are lots of features it doesn't offer in that. Even though it sort of says that it has a rendering backend, actually what's provided in that is quite limited. It gets the job done, certainly, but it's not as extensive as you might imagine. Now, the engine also lacks networking, which is quite a big sell these days, and although it is difficult to find good networking out of the box, having some fundamental implementation allows you to implement your own features more easily, I generally tend to find. What is there in terms of the recast and detour implementation is a very difficult code base to work with. It's very much rushed in, so it doesn't have a consistently isolated API. Some features aren't implemented, and it, again, like most things I'm going to be saying today, it's a half-finished job. Now, video texture is a very useful library, but again, it has some fundamental quirks in how it's implemented. There are still bugs which arise due to certain inconsistencies in how the rasterizer deals with video texture objects. And if you've looked at the Python API, it's a little bit sideways in how it's dealt with. And if you start looking into the code in C++, it just doesn't make any sense. It does everything in a very sideways fashion. And that's, again, more of a developer problem than a user problem, but it still exists, and that is something that does cause us concern. Now, the other biggest feature that we have is bullet physics, as I've already mentioned, but bullet physics is, again, not quite there. For starters, we don't have any Python API for it, really, so you can't create physics objects in the game engine, and you can't access any of the shape data yourself. So if you wanted to change or destroy physics objects in the game engine, for example, for real-time destruction, you almost definitely cannot do that. And for the same reason, you also can't modify meshes inside the game engine. And that is actually something that advanced users do miss quite a lot, and I've on occasion wished I had the ability to do that. The only current solution I see as being possible is to actually create BPy as a module, create Blender as a module of BPy and then import it, and basically ask Blender to cut the mesh in the way that you'd like it and then libload it in. And that's a bit of a long, slow, laborious process, and it does a lot of overhead which isn't necessarily needed. So all of these features which currently exist actually aren't as good as they are on paper, and that's something that we need to be honest about, because it's all well and good saying that your engine is perfect and has all of these features, but when half of them don't work or cause bugs or are slow, etc., ultimately you're not being honest with yourselves or your users. Now, it's important to note that no one is actually trying to sell a game engine as a hoax, and no one is pushing forward to sell it, because there's no financial incentive to do that. It's all done by developers. But those developers, to some extent, are proud of their engine, and if users sort of start talking about all these great features that the Blender game engine has, it's quite hard to say no, really. But I digress. Why is this all relevant? Why is it relevant to say this? Well, it's very simple. For most users, the game engine isn't the internal code. The internal code is not relevant to those users. What's relevant is the scripting interface and the user interface. Now, the user interface can be basically copied across engines. You just have to implement it as a developer, and that's not hard, because basically all the user interface does is map visual elements into internal game elements, which most game engines provide. So things like physics objects are provided by most game engines, lighting, and for simple things like shader modes, showing the mouse pointer, all of these features are very easy to implement in another game engine. Now, the only thing that isn't so easy is the scripting interface, and the reason for that is they tend to be very specific to the game engine that defines them. The Blender game engine has what I believe is a relatively unfriendly scripting interface. Unfriendly meaning that it's quite limited in its scope. You can't create any new data inside the game engine with the scripting interface very easily, except for with libnew. And very few features work interoperably. So unless you see a method, for example, defined do something with X, then the object in question is probably not going to be reusable. In other engines, you can get a certain type of object, and other kind of features can use those objects, and everything's very granular and reusable. And that has a lot of power for the developer, because ultimately the game engine developers shouldn't really need to develop in C++ if the engine has a scripting layer that isn't C++. And so there's no point providing a Python API in the Blender game engine if it doesn't do half the things you want it to do. And when you spend most of your time working around bugs and feature problems, you don't spend your time doing what's important, which is making the game. The engine should make it easier to make a game, not harder. So we've now basically discussed what a game engine is, which is well done. Why is it important to talk about this? Well, for most users, as I've said, it's the user interface and the scripting interface that matters, and of those two, the scripting interface is really the only unique feature of the Blender game engine. So that should beg the question, if you can deal with changing from a weak scripting interface to a stronger scripting interface, and most developers, if they're capable at scripting, will be able to do that, then what is the BGE? What is important about it? What is special about it? If you can provide the current features that the game engine provides, but with more performance, with more maintainability, and stronger scripting APIs, there is no real reason to advocate sticking with the Blender game engine other than nostalgia and, to some extent, investment. Because if you look at my Blender Artists post account, I have over nearly 5,500 posts, and most of those, if not nearly all of them, are devoted to Blender game engine specific features. I've spent time looking at developing the code, I've spent time working around it, I've spent a lot of time with Blender and its game engine, and that's where I started. So I have a lot of investment in the engine, personally speaking. I have projects unfinished, and if you'd asked me this question a year ago, I probably would have almost definitely said, no, we need to salvage the game engine. But then I sort of realised that the game engine, the Blender game engine, isn't unique. If you look at the feature list of any engine, let's look at the Panda feature list, for example, Panda 3D and .org. Look at the Panda feature list, and I am talking about Panda quite a lot, and that's because that's the engine I think is probably the best to replace or complement the Blender game engine at the moment. So let's look at the features it has. We have, let's go down. So we have the ability to distribute your games, which is what the Blender game engine offers. You can embed it in the web, which is what we sort of have at the moment, although this is natively supported by Panda 3D. There is some AI implementation. There's networking built in. There's lots of timing and more in-depth Python API support for things like threading, file I/O. There's also bullet physics, there's ODE physics, and there's also the Panda physics. There's a matrix and math engine, which we currently have with MathUtils. There's lots of hardware support, as the Blender game engine does offer as well, but if you look at things like the joystick, there's quite a lot more support for external libraries. So, for example, here we use Pygame, which is just as usable as any other library. Where am I going? And there's also things like separation of rendering data to actual geometry data, and there's finite state machines, there's GUI, although the GUI isn't particularly desirable actually, but there's also the Blender game engine GUI, which we can use here. There's lots of support for timing and tasks and so on, which is quite useful for things like dialogue and cutscenes. There's lots of shader support, and that's coming. There are some developments here which will make shaders much more user-friendly. But probably the most important thing is just the depth of the API. Now, one of the things that most users want to do is work out where things collide and hit points. Now, I've added a patch for this in the Blender game engine, but it is substandard because it doesn't seem to yield the correct results. Now, if we look at the bullets API in Panda, you can do things like ray tests without needing an object. You can do sweep tests, which is really useful. And those are very good for things like collisions and if you watch the, I was going to say Lugaroo, if you watch the overgrowth development log videos, they use sweep tests for certain kinds of collision jumping checks, and contact tests. And those will give you the distance, the impulses, the positions, and that's what most users are looking for in a collision API. So that's something that if we replaced the game engine with, that we currently have, or at least complemented it, we'd have a lot of features to work with. Now, as a developer, the most important thing for me and for anyone else who would work on this project is to ensure that the user experience, which is provided by the user interface, is exactly the same, or as close as possible. And for the most part, that shouldn't be too difficult, just normal integration really. There's nothing specific to the Blender game engine and how it's implemented in Blender. But in doing that, you've already removed most of the work. Now, one thing that's really cool, that's really exciting, is that the way that Panda is being considered to be implemented is using this rendering API, but the rendered viewport shading. And that allows you to tweak data in real time without having to quit and start the game engine. And this also allows you to, because Blender is running, you could, at a later stage, look at creating, if we open up my other branch of Blender, you could look at having some nodal logic running, and you could have a node editor and actually debug it in real time. And the reason that's quite exciting is because it's a new feature that you can't currently do with the current Blender game engine, because it basically takes over the Blender main loop. So Blender doesn't update its user interface or anything until you quit the game engine, by which time you can't debug its state. So, for example, you might load in some nodes and then debug their state in real time. So there's a lot of potential in embarking on a project like this. And I think the real reason that people are scared is because they don't think that they're going to be able to work with the changes. I think there's also a level of loyalty which is admirable but sometimes misplaced. And we should all stress really that as a developer, the most important thing is to ensure that the user experience is consistent across all kinds of users. Now, one thing that will make any kind of transition with a game engine easier is that things like the logic editor, I'm working on Hive, and once you get rid of the logic editor and convert all of these properties to another engine's format, there's nothing really specific that you need to worry about. That's all you need for a game engine, is physics, logic, and rendering. And of course there's other components to it, but those are the main three. So if you've handled those, that's all you need for a game engine. And the excitement and the possibilities provided by a new engine would be, in my opinion, significantly outweigh any doubts that people have in their mind. Now, I'm aware this has been more of a talking video and less of a doing video, but it's important to get these ideas out in the open. So if you're interested in what's been going on, we had a discussion, and there's a huge document on, where is it? Yes, it's on Google Docs, and it's linked in one of the forums. I think it's actually under a thread named Developer Meeting on IRC and Google Drive in the Game Engine Support Forum. And it basically discusses all of the ideas that I've discussed. And I also have another document on Google Drive, which I haven't shared the link anywhere publicly, but it's available publicly. And the purpose of that document is basically to discuss where I see the current issues to be with the game engine. And I wrote this when I was originally considering rewriting the game engine or implementing new parts to it. And you can basically read the preamble, the current problems, and so on if you're interested. Now, one last idea that I'd like to discuss is the concept of funding and of the involvement of the Blender Foundation and the main Blender trunk. So that happened. I don't think I'll edit that out. Yeah, so the way in which the Blender, the rest of the Blender Development Committee are involved is really just, the only call they really need to make is whether the game engine code remains in Blender and whether any specific Blender features that are provided for the game engine are removed. Now, if those features are removed, it should still be perfectly feasible to implement a game engine that uses Blender as an editor. And that's the most important thing. Blender is useful because it's a great 3D environment, and it provides all of the features that an editor for a game engine needs, and more. And that integration is really what makes the Blender game engine worth using over any other free, commercial, or otherwise software. And there is a merit to the argument that if we remove the Blender code, the Blender game engine code, that we free up basically a lot of mess. It'll improve compilation times if you have to build with the game engine, which is what the current Blender releases do. And it also frees up developers currently working on the game engine to work on other engines. Sorry, to work on other parts of the Blender code base. Now, users sort of have this fear that we just want to remove the game engine because it's annoying us. And whilst that might be true for certain developers, for the majority of the game engine developers that is not the case, and they will consistently attempt to provide a consistent user interface that is fun to use and powerful and extensible. And once people get that into their heads, hopefully, the prospect of changing engines or whatever the future direction is will not be so scary. Thank you for watching, and I will endeavour to follow this up with another video if I feel it necessary.